This evening we want to study what the Hindu calls the Kamaru, or desire body of man. First of all, we should point out that there is not complete agreement even among the Indian schools as to the meaning of this term or the reasonable extensions of it in the study of man's superphysical construction. Therefore, what we have tried to do is to synthesize and create as far as possible a composite picture of the several different basic schools of thought. And where it seems essential, we will point out these differences. The word itself, Kamarupa, is composed of two words of the Indian language, Kama, which literally means desire, and Rupa, which means body or form. Therefore, it is the body or form of desire. Yet even in the Indian schools, we find that the word desire is subject to a number of modifications. Included among the synonyms for this term in this usage is volition. And this has quite a different meaning to our thinking in the simple problem of desire. Yet, as we go further, we shall observe a number of parallels between the Hindu schools and the rising concepts of Western psychology, especially as these relate to the anima-animus problem, which seemingly is founded in the study of this vehicle of man. We have pointed out already that the constitution of man consists of a series of bodies of which the physical alone is visible. That these bodies are each of them derived from a plane or substance which exists in nature, in the universe, and in the atmosphere, visible and invisible, of our own planet. Thus, a rupa, or a body, must always be formed around certain vortices or centers of energy, and it will be formed by the materials available in the great reservoir of natural substances, materials in each case upon the level or plane of the body itself. This means that in Indian thinking, man's desires arise not essentially from a spiritual being, but from a body, and that desire on its own level is not so different from the creature comfort problem of the physical body. The physical body has certain needs, certain demands, and a kind of existence of its own. It must be supplied and served, and always the master is the servant of his own servant. And this is true in the case of the emotional or desire nature just as much as it is of the physical. We've also pointed out that the body of desire, per se, is associated with the physical body through the corresponding etheric instrument. And we devoted, I think, sufficient time last week to the study of this etheric binding principle, so that we need not repeat here. The Kamarupa is divisible usually into two parts, which are termed higher and lower. These correspond to what is termed the plane of natural desire substance, which is a plane of molecular energy. In the cosmological systems of the Hindus, the desire or kamic plane is divisible into an upper and lower part, the upper part being called Devachan and the lower part Kamaloka. Now these two planes represent, to our way of thinking, something of the story unfolded in Dante's story of the Inferno, or the Divine Comedy. Here we find Dante ascending from the purgatorio to the Paradiso, or from purgatory to paradise. And in Indian thinking, Devachan is equivalent to paradise, and Kamaloka is equivalent to purgatory. Now, the reason why Kamaloka, or the lower part of the plane of desire, is likened to a sphere of punishment, I think we all begin to understand better perhaps today when we know more of man's psychological structure than we did 50 years ago. We all realize, even in our daily living, that there is a relationship between volition and desire on the one hand, and the condition in which we live on the other. In other words, the individual is constantly punished, even here, if his desire structure or his desire impulses become unreasonable. The average person can take a comparatively pleasant and harmonious environment and destroy it by his own emotional excess. We all know this to be true, that unless we govern, direct, control, and integrate emotions, they can become a tremendous cause of difficulty. In Europe, where Eastern philosophy drifted into Western thinking, particularly through the Gnostics, Neoplatonists, and other early sects, there was gradually developed a term which later in the French school of Transcendentalism was called the astral light. Now, the astral light is an interesting thought because the word astral, of course, comes from star. The word deva comes from the root meaning to shine, and there is a great deal of a great deal of similarity between certain Eastern and Western concepts. The astral light of Western magic and Western transcendentalism was the great sphere of illusion. And in Eastern philosophy, the kamic sphere, or the sphere of desire, is associated with this. Therefore, it was assumed by Buddhism, particularly, that desires are the basis of an illusionary or an imaginary or a fantastic relationship between creatures and facts. Each individual, therefore, suffers from the distorting effects of his own emotional coloring. For this reason, the sphere of desire, or the kamic sphere, was also identified with the deity Mara, the god of illusion and the tempter of Buddha. Desire is forever luring the individual to that which is its inevitable correlative, the gratification of the desire. And therefore, in the study of man, we find this principle, this body within him, this structure within his own nature, by which all of his desires are activated. And furthermore, that the desires themselves are engendered within the mystery of this region of fantasy. Thus, in the average person, the Kamarupa is the body of fantasy, the body of imagination. It is connected in Indian philosophy with the moon because of the inconstancy of the light of this luminary. It is the part of man which gives him great happiness one moment and great misery the next. It is the inevitable energy within him which causes him to like some things without reason and to dislike others on the same basis. We have mentioned before in various discussions that for the average person, the principal motivation for living is desire. This passes through a series of refinements. Some desire only good things, others are not so particular. But in any event, desire is the motivation. The desire to live, as Buddha points out, is the basis of the great cycle of necessity, or the cycle of rebirth. Desire must consequently be considered the most powerful force in the life of man today. It is the force which causes the activation of practically all superior factors or faculties within the Constitution. As we have also pointed out, thought follows desire. It does not lead it. in the present constitution of the human being. And without interest, which is a form of desire, without emotional coloring, like or dislike, without the motivation of hope or fear or faith or belief, without these circumstances, man remains comparatively inactive. It is therefore only through the pressure of certain coloring within himself that he is led to depart from comparative inertia. Practically every achievement of mankind that is commendable has been built upon faith or hope, both of which are forms of desire material. The greatest crimes that have been committed against humanity have been committed in the name of ambition, or in the name of greed, or in the name of tyranny, which are also emotional excesses. Once these excesses dominate in a life, the mind is used as the instrument for the rational solution of the ambitions or the aggressions which the desire has stimulated. It must naturally follow, then, that in the constitution of man, the desire nature is an extremely important one, and its action upon all other parts of the personality are dominant in the majority of cases. It also follows that the desire nature, which is the mainspring of the volitional attitude of man in his present state, must be the cause of innumerable consequences. Therefore, kama and karma are closely linked. Where there is no kama, there is no karma. Where there is no desire, there is no consequence. The relationship of these two is exceedingly vital. Now, the emotional body, or the desire body, the Kamaru, is also the basis of two other general termed expressions of man's life. These are summarized under the simple statement that karma is the source of both motion and emotion. In other words, desire is at the root of motion, and things move because of desires, perhaps two dominant contrary desires. One desire being to approach in order perhaps to possess, the other being to depart or to escape. Therefore, in the life of man, motion is the result of the desire to survive. It is also the result of the desire to attain, to possess, to do. Gradually the hands of man came into existence because of what we call need. Need is rooted in desire. And wherever there is motion, there is some degree of desire. Motion in its completest form is found in the animal kingdom, where we find the animal instinctively and inevitably moving in accordance to instinct or impulse. In man, movement is to a degree subordinated to the mind or to the purposes of the individual. He may be by nature and desire a rolling stone, but he has discovered that it is more necessary to his survival that he learn to stay in one place, learn to labor, and to moderate his natural instincts and impulses. Thus, the impulse to move and the impulse of emotion, which is to possess in some sense of the word, these two are the principal elements of the kamic nature. The vehicle of kama, particularly in the body of man, is the blood. And through the blood, the desire principle is disseminated completely throughout the structure of the body. Its seat and particular center in man is the great lobe of the liver. And therefore, wherever we find a creature with warm blood, a creature possessing the power of motion, we find a being endowed with an emotional body, although this may be in a comparatively undeveloped state. The study of the Kamarupa as it relates to man may begin with a consideration of it according to the Hindu philosophy. We know that in their system, generally speaking, The Kamarupa is the first of the superior vehicles of man which has a permanent or relatively permanent existence. The etheric body, the vital energy field, must survive the body, as we said last week, but it survives for only a short time. It is not a permanent body. It is not a vehicle. And it is gradually separated from the superior vehicles along with the physical body of which it is essentially a part. For ether and matter are merely octaves of each other. Actually, therefore, the Kamarupa is the so-called body of man after death. It is that vehicle which has a continuance. And in the ancient beliefs, it gradually took on certain attributes or aspects of the physical body, but was somewhat larger and less vertically integrated from a structural standpoint. During life, it is described as a field of light surrounding the body and extending from 8 to 12 inches in an oval form, its great vortex or center being in juxtaposition to the liver. Within this body will be observed the gradually developing structure of organs. These organs, as in all such structures in nature, begin with vortices, or whirling chakras of energy, and these gradually develop according to the development and growth of the physical personality. In Hindu philosophy, the Kamarupa is the result of man's experience. The substance from which it is composed is natural, but just as man must extend a principle into matter in order to create a physical body from the substances around him, so man must extend certain principles into the material of the desire world, and around these principles or vortices gather the material for this body. And this process of the generation of the so-called Kamarupa is tremendously influenced by the growth and development of the emotional life of the human being. It is said that the principle of Kama dominates life until the 7th year. After that, the individual begins to gradually dominate, mold, and modify the kamic body, which reaches its greatest degree of intensity about the 14th year. The Kamarupa, then, being a body of desire, is also essentially fashioned from experience. The purpose of life is experience. The purpose of emotional activity is that the individual shall learn. And that which he must learn, regardless of his inclinations, is the moderation of all powers and faculties. Because only through their moderation can they be sublimated. And only through sublimation can they be reconciled. And the composite chain of vehicles become one consecutive and consistent organization. The next point to remember is that as man's after-death experience is transferred to the Kamarupa, so it becomes a kind of body world in which the individual exists. We know that it is composed of the materials of the kamic plane or world, just as the material body is of the elements of the earth. But these materials forming the kamic body have certain differences from those which we know physically. For example, in the kamic body there is no necessity for objective sensory perceptions, as in the case of physical existence. There is no need for the power to see, or the power to hear, or the power to taste. These senses are necessary in a certain environment. In the kamic sphere, such functions, such faculties, have no value because of the nature of that world, and because the contact in that world is entirely upon the level of desire or emotion vibration. Also, we should bear in mind that the human entity, the ego, passing into the after-death state, and for instance, entering into its own desire structure, entering into its own Kamarupa, and becoming polarized there, as it was earlier polarized physically. Becomes, so to say, a sovereign over a sphere, just as the incarnating entity becomes a kind of sovereign over the physical body. This sphere, however, of Kamarupa is very different, and we have no simple method of explaining it to you, except perhaps by analogy. And we must remember that all analogies have a measure of imperfection in them. Similes, parables, allegories are delightful things if we do not overwork them. But they cannot be carried beyond a certain degree. Therefore, we can only generalize by means of them. Perhaps, then, the best way in which we can symbolize the existence of a being in the Kamarupa is to have a parallel in the dream life of man. Now, in a dream fantasy, or to that degree, into a certain highly developed waking fantasy, or daydreaming, the individual discovers dimensions which are totally beyond physical estimation. He discovers, for example, that in his subjective dream life, that he enters into himself, and at the same time seems to enter into a vast world. He does not really know or experience the fact that this world that he visits in dreams, a world ever-changing, kaleidoscopic in its potentials, a world of motion, light, color. He is entering into a sphere of internalization. Perhaps in his dream he may travel to far countries, climb mountains, or fly over valleys. But all of these things are actually taking place within his own kamic field. He is never leaving this field. In his dream he may meet persons who have been dead for ages. He is not meeting them, he is meeting his own emotional images of them. He may at the same time face extraordinary hazards. He may come upon enemies. He may find himself on a battlefield with armies. He may be surrounded by millions of other persons, as in a great pageant of some nature. Or he may find himself shipwrecked upon a vast ocean, the boundaries of which are beyond his vision or his sense. Yet all of these immensitudes, whether of heaven and earth, whether of number or quality, all of these things are taking place within the mysterious mirror of his own astral shape or shadow. His dream world never extends, under usual conditions, outside of his own fantasy. But he discovers that his fantasy is immeasurable. It cannot be limited or circumscribed. In his fantasy he can visit the most distant star and seemingly live there. In his fantasy he can speak all languages. In his fantasy he can be placed under the most terrible hazards or elevated to the greatest dignities. He may not be alone. He may be in any kind of a world that his own desires have brought into being. In your psychological study, we know, for instance, the importance of various dreams in which the individual, due to his own neurotic condition, or to such psychotic states as may have developed within him, is subject to symbolic or even archetypal dreams. Dreams which are curiously related to the frustration of his emotions, to the intensities of his desires. And these desires, taking symbolic forms, are revealed to him, as Freud pointed out, through imagery, which must be interpreted, because the real meaning is not immediately apparent. Now, it would be understandable, therefore, that if an entity, submerged temporarily in its own astral body, should be able to return and describe the circumstances of such a journey to other persons in a material, objective life, that his story might be as strange as any account given by Emanuel Swedenborg or any of the wonders of the summerland described by Andrew Jackson Davis. He would be quite certain that he had been placed to places, that he had seen shining temples on the tops of hills, that he had seen figures robed in white, that he had gone somewhere where there were mountains and rivers and streams, and like the happy hunting ground of the old Indian warrior, that he had actually entered a place. Yet another seer or mystic of similar ability would bring back a totally different description of this place. A good Muslim, under the conditions of such a mystical adventure, would probably come back with a full description of Muhammad's paradise to come. A good Presbyterian would undoubtedly come back with a slightly different account. We know that the Hindu might definitely find himself on the broad path leading up to the crest of Mount Meru, where the devas and gods dwelt together. The atheist would probably wander around in a hole in the dark because he's certain that that is all that there is, and he would undoubtedly insist upon finding out in this space nothing but himself. He probably would deny his own existence, but be unable to account why it was that, not existing, he was able to remember so clearly that he did not exist. All of which is a peculiar situation. Now, in the Greek and ancient mystery rites, there are descriptions of these great herds of souls moving in space. And Dante describes the sleepers in the caverns under the earth who sleep through the ages because they believed in death. All of these experiences occur not in a place, but within the tremendous internal emotional potential of living things. Emotion is therefore a very fluidic and mysterious quality. And nearly all of the emotions that we feel are rooted in the subjective emotions that we have built up through the ages in the processes of living. Our emotions, as we express them objectively, therefore, are a form of dream symbolism brought through into action, causing us to love this, to hate that, to desire something else, because of the pressures that lie within this emotional scope itself. During our physical life, the emotions move through us. During the metaphysical experience of man after death, according to the Hindus, he moves through his own emotional life. He lives in it. He has no existence apart from it. It becomes the new house in which he lives. But in many instances, in fact in most instances, it is a haunted house, because it is filled with the inevitable consequences of desire intensity. We can begin to appreciate this also psychologically. We know what bad emotional habits will do to a person in the course of 30 or 40 years. What is an emotional habit? Is an emotional habit merely an automatic physical thing? The Hindu would say no, that the emotional habit is the actual building of a kind of entity, a geometrical, vibratory being within the structure of the emotional life. And therefore, that gradually the emotions, if seriously perverted or wrongly educated over a period of time, become tyrants and begin to project their own emotion patterns and forms upon the objective life. To a degree, therefore, what we call disease has its emotional equivalent, because in the emotional sphere, what we call disease causes various evils, obstructions, tumors, and things of that nature. What we now call such emotional growths, complexes, or fixations, or something of that nature. But actually they exist, built up and sustained and intensified by our own emotional pressures. It is from this concept, and all that relates to it, of course, that we have gradually fashioned our image of the devil. The devil, of course, is the total pressure of desire on the negative level. He is usually represented as dressed in red because he is vested in the human blood. And also, as Mephisto points out in Faust, when he signs his pact with Faust, Mephisto says to the old philosopher alchemist, "Sign this pact with blood, for blood is a most peculiar essence." and blood becomes the carrier of this kamic pressure. And the individual, moved by his own negative emotional pressures, resulting in acts of evil, is said, therefore, to be under the influence of the devil. The principle of evil is, therefore, the principle of negative or uncontrolled and unregenerated desire. Now, it sometimes happens that where the desire nature is particularly strong, where the skandhas, as we described them in a previous series of talks on Buddhist philosophy and rebirth, where the skandhas have built tremendously aggressive forms in the Kamarupa, or in the desire body. If such condition exists, the desires may and do gain in intensity to become a tremendous problem to the individual who passes through this region of desire, or region of illusion. Now, as the physical body is dropped after an appropriate period of life, so the entity or being must also ultimately depart from the Kamarupa, which is a vehicle just as much as the body is. Having passed through the purgatorial phase of this matter, he then approaches the higher phases of emotion, or the devachanic plane, and gradually he moves through the entire sphere of desire, exhausting its potentials, passing from infancy to youth, maturity, and age on the level of desire, just as he has previously done so on the physical level. At the end of a certain period of time, therefore, he departs from the desire body and passes into the next higher vehicle, or the rupa manas, the mental form. When he dies out of the kamarupa, or desire body, this body is not subject to the services of what we would term today adequate undertaking facilities. We don't have them over there. A body or vehicle above the physical does not pass through funeral services and the like. What happens with it is that it gradually disintegrates within its own field, when it is no longer held together by the will and yoga of the being in the body. The etheric body naturally begins to disintegrate within 48 to 72 hours. And therefore, its actual process of disintegration is measured in terms of the deterioration and decomposition of the physical body. The Kamarupa, however, does not so rapidly dissipate. And we have a very elaborate group of stories, legends, myths, and accounts in the various religions of the East and the ancient world concerning the Kamarupa and what happens to it. This body of desire, after the entity is no longer inhabiting it, naturally begins the process of dying. But because of the extreme subtlety of the element in which it functions, and because of the peculiar structure which itself possesses, this disintegration is not rapid nor immediate, but takes a considerable period of time. This is a time in which the great sphere in which this body exists, the substance or the kamic material of nature, begins the process of corrupting the artificial vehicle which has been set up in it. The parallel to this might be the processes of nature closing in on the buried body in the earth. The physical body of man gradually disintegrates as the result of nature equipping itself with numerous forces to gradually destroy the remaining fleshy part of the physical organism. In the level of Kama, this also takes place, and a complete system of forces operating in the kamic world begin the slow process of breaking down this body. They do it by variously attacking it, and they do it also by gradually absorbing its various elements and vital components. This gives rise to a series of very interesting symbols, myths, and legends. Perhaps you may have seen a Chinese painting of the Last Judgment, or a picture from some old Hindu religious work showing tormented souls in hell. Here you will find all kinds of beings, apparently human souls. that are being boiled in vats of oil and cut apart and variously tormented and tortured. Actually, the Indian philosophy tells us that this represents the gradual disintegration of the Kamarupa, and that long before this process begins, the being in it has departed. It is only an actual process of breaking down the elements of desire, the exhaustion and neutralization of the complex centers that have been set up in the emotional substance of nature. Therefore, nature on the level of desire moves in and begins to break up fears, break up hates, break up all the complexes and neuroses that have been set up in this body. It does so, however, after the entity has passed through certain experiences and departed from that vehicle. As these different vices or excesses of emotion are referred to as the 7 deadly sins, the various deities are supposed to go to work on these sins and punish them. Actually, this punishment is the neutralization of this sphere, or the reduction of the emotional substance, so that it is again available for new emotional bodies which the other human beings or various forms in nature must call upon, just as the earth, having reduced forms to itself, is again available for use in the reconstruction of new bodies. This, in turn, leads to another series of interesting thoughts. Suppose the intensity of the emotional nature is so great that after the death of the individual, and he has remained, we will say, in the complex of Kamaloka and Devachan for the normal cycle of about 150 years, that he then passes on, leaving behind him this shell. This shell, however, is not exactly merely a dead carcass floating around. It is really an animate carcass, because it is still completely motivated and vitalized by the desire substance, which is its principle. It is therefore a creature with desire, but without mind, consciousness, or soul, because these have gone on to other experiences. It may, however, continue for some time as a comparatively animate thing, because every vehicle of man has a certain consciousness of its own, in addition to the consciousness that is bestowed upon it for the superior part. Let us assume, therefore, that an individual has had a particularly tempestuous emotional life, that he has succeeded in going through his 70 years and 10 or more without ever having controlled an emotion, or very nearly that. That he has been a complete victim of his appetites and his animal instincts all the way along, that he has lived almost totally for sensory gratification, and that in this gratification he has not hesitated to damage the rights, privileges, lives, the consciousness of other persons. In other words, he has been a rather unpleasant character of an intense emotional type. Now, it is very possible that after the entity departs into the lower or rupa manas, or mental body, which is that beyond, above, and within the desire body, that this body, which he has left behind, will not disintegrate even as rapidly as might normally be expected. The intensities within it have almost embalmed it. The emotional structure has become so dominant and so completely powerful that its endurance may be considerable. Now, there is an Indian belief, for example, that when this entity, having completed the cycle and entered into the rebirth cycle, and descending again, begins to build a new emotional body to live in the next incarnation, that it may do so before the old one has disintegrated completely. This is the mystery of the so-called dead planet, or the lost planet, or the dead star. For it is said that under such conditions, the old kamic body becomes what Lord Lytton calls in his books the dweller on the threshold. It becomes the impairment, or becomes the obstacle to the rebirth of the individual because of the tremendous intensities which have not been exhausted within it. This subject is a rather large one. We can only touch on it, but it is one phase of the study of the activities of the kamic structure. Now also, we know that apart from such an excessive state of affairs, that the desires of the average person do become troublesome. We know also that desires and the consequences of desires, particularly in terms of suffering, are to a measure blunted by the fact that the desire vibration has to move through physical matter. And therefore our desires are not nearly as intense while we are embodied as they would be if we did not have this physical vehicle, because the attunement, though adequate for our ordinary need, is not as perfect as we might perhaps desire or for which we might be thankful. As a result of this, the intensities of our own emotional actions and reactions are greater after the physical body has been discarded. The individual, therefore, having passed into the Kamaru, becomes, so to say, a citizen located and polarized within the field of his own desires. For him now, there is no physical break upon desire. There is no resistance from physical circumstances. Environment no longer restrains or limits. And the absence of body makes these desires infinitely more intense and clear, even as is often the case in dream symbolism. The person then is said to be susceptible to what we call purgatory. For purgatory is nothing more or less than living in the total atmosphere of your own desires. Living in the animosities, antagonisms, and antipathies which you have allowed to flow through you toward others. But now you must sort of stew in them. There is no escape, no way out, no evasion. The Kamaloka, or world of desire, looks, acts, and is exactly the way you feel about everything. This could easily mean that a suspicious person would chase shadows forever in this dark shadow world. That a jealous person would be devoured by jealousy indefinitely. There's the story of the old Egyptian moneylender who put up his stand and his scales at the entrance of Kamaloka and proceeded to lend money to lost souls who were never able to pay, which was a great torment to him, but he could never stop doing it. Then there is, of course, the story in Dante about the men rolling the bags of gold uphill, and every time they almost got them to the top, the bags rolled back and they had to start over again. The squirrel cage of desire. Things going round and round and never going anywhere. The individual constantly and continuously under the pressure of his own feelings, under the pressure of his own unregenerate or untransmuted impulses. Impulses that can become infinitely more intense until the person staggers about, as the old classics say, intoxicated with desire. Under such conditions, excesses of desire usually being negative, it would be rather evident that the being would not have a particularly happy time. The purpose for the entire experience, of course, is to exhaust as much as possible of the desire factor in the interval between re-embodiment. The purpose being that the individual should gradually learn that these intensities are not only unreasonable but unreal, and that man should discover that the universe he lives in, regardless of its factual nature, is always colored by what he believes, what he thinks, and how he feels. Therefore, it is essential to his own good that he thinks good thoughts, feels kindly about everything, and holds only such beliefs as he can live with in an intimate association with his own nature. Here we again see something of the pattern in the escapist tendencies of modern man, who, fearing to live with himself, seeks all kinds of diversements in order to escape this constant association with himself. In Kamaloka, of course, he is with himself. He is very near himself all the time. And he must live with the self that he is. He must put up with the things himself which he has made others put up with here in the physical world. So this body becomes a very valuable lesson ground. For in it man finally must experience the causes and the consequences of every emotion that flows into objective expression. The refinement and regeneration of these emotions is therefore a very important phase of man's life. Referring again to the idea of the magic garden, of the astral light of the European transcendentalists, we are reminded of the enchanted garden of Klingsor the magician in the opera of Parsifal. Here we have the story of the astral light, or the story of the Kamarupic illusion. This is the one mysterious world of beautiful flowers, around the stem of each of which is twisted a poisonous serpent. This is also, according to the Hindu philosophy, the graveyard of would-be yogis. For the reason that man, attempting internalization, attempting to seek for truth within himself, must find various means of conveying his consciousness through this wonderland of things that are not so. And as the slightest inclination makes anything appear to be so, this is the world of wish fulfillment. Anything we want is there. Anything we expect is so. But it is only a dream. And in this world, or in this stage of things, it is perfectly conceivable that the individual should follow will-o'-the-wisps indefinitely. That is the reason why in Buddhism there is such a tremendous emphasis upon desirelessness. Because it is the only way in which man can pass the mystery of the dark moon without being hopelessly involved in excessive ideas. We find this also well exemplified in the physical life of man, where various psychical and mystical experiences are usually exaggerated far beyond even their probable content. The individual says, "I saw it, I know it is so." But in this mystery of the astral light, the things we see are not so. The things we hear are not so. Because they are nothing more or less than our own wishes. And any dishonest wish of ours will produce another delusion. This in turn becomes manifested through into the physical life again, where our wishful thinking makes us friends and enemies, builds lives and ruins them, and causes us to start out on innumerable adventures of knight errantry as ill-considered as those of Don Quixote de la Mancha. Every time that we go out lancing windmills, it is because we have become the servants of some illusion within ourselves. The Indian yogi and sannyasin therefore emphasizes the tremendous importance of the desireless search for reality. That the individual can have neither hope nor fear, that he can believe neither good nor evil, but that he must sustain a complete suspension of judgment while he moves through this strange wonderland of light and color and sound. All these problems of illusion do come back to us in psychology again, because most persons are dominated by illusions of some kind, and lots of people feel that their illusions are what are keeping them alive, that without the illusion nothing would be worthwhile. Actually, this is not true, because in every illusion there is something less than the truth. The truth is always greater than any illusion that we can possibly hold concern with. But as the desire world, or the sphere of the Kamarupa in man, not only gives us pictures, but it paints us portraits. It can cause things to be completely visible, both to the internal and through projection, sometimes even apparently to the external perceptions. It can cause us to become lost in a dream, so that we no longer know where it begins or where it ends, where we are no longer able to tell whether the waking part is real or whether the dream is real. And in this problem, of course, it is obvious that the moment we start to follow one of these will-o'-the-wisps, the moment the dream becomes apparently more real, the moment the thing hoped for apparently materializes before us, the dreaming, the hoping, and the imagining are intensified until the circle becomes ever more vicious. And somewhere in the subject we lose the entire proportion and dimension of truth. Man is not left, however, to this device. And in order that the Kamarupa may not control it, he has been given a mind, an organizing power of reason, by means of which he can weigh and estimate the results of intensity. Yet his emotional life is old and rich and valuable and important. It is a very useful servant, but a tyrannical master. It is something which, properly understood, bestows progress, and when improperly understood, binds man to a purgatory. Now, the Kamarupa represents the lower part of this emotion complex in man. That part which, as we have said, is likened to the astral body. Yet man has an entirely different group of emotions also. And these are the ones that are brought into play in the higher levels of the body of desire, and these are related to the devachanic sphere of insight or emotional consciousness. We can, for example, recognize emotions which by their very nature are sublimated to a very high degree. We have not only man's desire to dominate the world, we have another kind of desire, the simple desire of a Dr. Schweitzer to help other human beings. We have not only the individual whose desires are centered on a beefsteak, we have a Beethoven whose desires are centered in the abstract sphere of the creative arts. We have the materialist and we have the Michelangelo. We have the man who is essentially devoted to accumulation, and we have some saintly person who is perfectly willing to sacrifice all worldly security in the service of the truth as he understands it. Now, this is very tricky, however, because there have been a great many persons who have been sincerely following illusion. And that is where your peculiarity of your Kamarupic sphere or body is noted particularly. The individual can honestly follow a false light, and he can dishonestly follow a true light. This is due, again, to, however, the simple or pure quality of the emotional agent. Wherever an individual is deluded for any reason or on any condition, it is because of the operation of the skandhas within himself. No individual who is honestly unselfish can be deluded. But find the person. Find the individual whose motives are unconditioned by self-interest. Now, it would be apparently very hard to find such a person. We find, however, that the degree of such involvement differs with all persons. Some are almost completely dominated by self-interest, and in others it is so attenuated that they would not recognize it themselves. So we have a sliding scale on this problem, in which some are far more noble in their desires than others. And therefore, while self-interest is not absent, it is variously sublimated. And it is because of the fact that the sublimations of self-interest reach a degree in which the refinement of the emotions causes the emotional reaction to turn, so that instead of the person being plagued from within himself by his desires, he is blessed by them. When such an occurrence happens, we may assume that the ego, as Dante, has now passed into the paradiso, or the paradise. Now, paradise is not heaven. The paradise of Buddhism, Sukhavati, is a place of reward for the constructive use of desire. It is not a sphere of desirelessness. It is not the paranirvana of the ultimate liberation. It is, however, the place in which, or the condition in which, the nobility of desire brings a conditioned and qualified degree of happiness. It is not absolute happiness. Beethoven was not absolutely happy by any means. Neither was Wagner or Michelangelo or Leonardo. They had great satisfaction, undoubtedly, in a strange, selfish way, in the things that they did. They also had great satisfaction in the creativity which they released, and to a degree, undoubtedly, in the heritage which they left to others of beauty, of art, of music, and of fine things. These persons were sensitive. As individuals, they were both good and bad, as all human beings are. But there were certain sensitivities, certain values, which also had to have their consequences, had to have their fulfillments. And slowly, as the sublimation of emotion takes place, and the forms of its expression become less and less gross, there is this constant increase of positive emotional content. It is like the polarization of love and passion, one of which, passion, brings with it nearly always misery, whereas true love, even with great sorrow, finds great happiness. And these things are strangely intermingled. Great love does not break the cycle of the nidanas, or the causal sequences of cause and consequence, but it does give the individual a measure of fulfillment commensurate with the quality of the emotion which he has expressed. It is again cause and effect. It is equal, it is just, it is reasonable. But just as it is reasonable for us to be punished for some things, it is also reasonable for us to be recognized or rewarded for other things. Now we must realize that in this case, in the Indian philosophy, there is no arbitrary system of punishments and rewards. There is no book in which the record is kept. There is no angel or demon who administers sidereal justice. The ability of the individual to live compatibly with himself. Punishment, his inability to do so. Thus the higher or devachanic sphere is that in which the individual begins to experience the consolation of the intrinsic good which he has expressed upon the level of desire. He therefore begins to understand the meaning of the concept of the Buddhist transmutation of passion into compassion. He begins to realize why, from the beginning of time, the great teachers, the great scholars, the great moralists, the world's saviors, the great lawgivers, have set up codes of conduct through the following of which man is said to serve God or to serve good, and therefore to gain a certain right to internal and eternal happiness. In the devachanic part of the emotional body, or the higher part of the Kamarupa, therefore, we have this sphere of the unfoldment and expression of positive desire. The entire tonality of the integration changes. The individual begins to feel himself in a desirable and a beautiful situation in relation to his own nature. the visions, dreams, or experiences which are the symbolic expressions of himself are now appropriately clarified. They are benign. They are constructive. He finds himself not with tormentors, but with friends. And what he, of course, does not know is that these friends are the extension symbolically of his own friendliness. That those around him who are thoughtful are the extensions of his own thoughtfulness. And that those who forgive him his mistakes are the extensions of his own instinct to forgive others. Everything with which he is associated that is now fine is something that he has already inevitably and instinctively discovered to be fine through the experience of his own living. Thus he may be said to sort of enter a promised land. He may be said to be rewarded. He is simply rewarded because of what he is, even as he is punished because of what he is. Always now, of course, on the level of emotion only. So the emotional positivity of things is expressed through sublimity, through the emotional experience of adoration, through the veneration of things that are good, through the simple and very human, quiet enjoyment of that internal contentment which is the sign of integration. The individual who can live with himself will have a reasonably happy time on that part of the after-death plane which we call Devachan. Now, as he moves upward, it is the same person, because in each instance, in this body of ours, this composite body, of which the desire emotional body is one part, the records of the various levels of the activities of one individual are inevitably there, simply because they are the thing that caused the action, and they are the consequence of the action itself. So each human being, having a concatenation of emotional qualities, ascends gradually in consciousness from the lowest to the highest. And the individual who experiences the blessings and peace of Devachan is the same one who previously went through the less happy circumstances of Kamaloka. Having exhausted as far as is possible the negative aspect of life, the individual gradually seems to awaken. He begins to sense values. The illusions begin to die in him because he has re-experienced them so intensely that little by little he has that type of thing which is called illumination or enlightenment, especially in the sense of the Zen, the Buddhistic school of Japan. In Zen, no one is presumed to be able to convey the meaning of enlightenment. It can be known only to the individual to whom it happens. And in the process of the struggle through Kamaloka, there is a kind of awakening. Some people have it in this life. They, according to Plato, it is quite possible to go through a good deal of Kamaloka while you are alive. Because the moment you begin to attack emotional excess in yourself and understand through it, you begin to break down its power. And if it cannot control you here, it will not control you hereafter. If you can master it here, you do not have to face it. But for one who masters it, there are 9 who succumb to it, because they do not even recognize the importance of mastery. They do not realize that in the experience in Kamaloka that a greater need exists for integration than even here on the physical plane. But in any event, the experience of gradually awaking seems to occur also in the Kamarupic bodies. And the being moving through from the lower to the higher parts of this vehicle begins to function through the positive emotions which he may possess. We have assumed and we know that very few persons are completely bad and very few are wholly good. Therefore, everyone has a certain degree of these experiences, punishments and rewards, according to his own nature, according to his instincts. And as his actions arise from these subtle instincts within him, the so-called punishment for an action is not punishment for what happened, it was punishment for the instinct which caused it to happen. The same is true of the reward. Perhaps the instinct was never able to express itself adequately on the material level. But if it was there as a factual, constructive force, it also is intensified and released in the devachanic experience. So man passes through this body, growing up in it, through the miseries of Kamaloka, and into the maturity and into the quietude of Devachan, if he has earned the right to it. And having ascended through these spheres, he becomes more or less completely aware of his own psychic, emotional entity. Now the Kamaloka problem is, of course, intimately associated with the Christian concept of the soul, because this is exactly where this chemistry is taking place. What man terms soul is really the regenerated Kamarupic sheath. It is the entire emotion structure of man regenerated through the experiences of rebirth and purified constantly by the cycle of experience in Kamaloka. Thus man builds soul, which in turn becomes a luminous vehicle for him as he perfects its intangibles, until it becomes truly like the golden wedding garment of St. Paul, a wonderful vestment like the robes of glory of the high priest of Israel. So this invisible robe of glory is in reality being created or woven by the interchange of desires, positive and negative, in the constant life of the individual. This in turn brings us to the problem from a psychological standpoint. We know that in the Jungian system, for instance, we have the guardian and the shadow. We have the problem of the positive and negative poles of the psychic nature. The psychic nature is almost completely devachanic, or in its structure and in its function, because it is the root of volition. And volition is this pressing into activity of the various purposes of the individual. Let us consider then for a moment, try to diagram this a little bit, and assume now that we have a picture or a vision in our minds of the appearance of the Kamarupic sheath during life. It is egg-shaped, with the large end of the egg down. It surrounds the body and places it as in an alchemical bottle, or as the old Rosicrucian mystic said, as in a glass or crystal. The normal and natural color of this sheath, when seen by extrasensory perception, is a kind of iridescent opaline appearance. It is luminous. It is mostly of pearly type of color, with rose and blue, and has much of the opalescence that we see in certain stones. It is, of course, something utterly indescribable in terms of anything that we have seen, but this is approximately. This might be said to be the emotional body in complete repose, while it is doing nothing and is not contaminated. The moment, however, that emotion begins to move within the individual, it begins to cause an excitation in the field or contents of this globe. This globe surrounds the physical body and is associated with it by a whole series of magnetic fields and cords, which attach themselves to various parts of the body. Particularly, however, the major attachment, like an umbilicus, is to the liver. However, the emotional body attaches wherever there are certain types of cell structure and wherever there are certain magnetic cores within the body. It forms the basis of this sympathy. Now, in the course, for instance, of getting good and angry over something, you see the emotional vehicle gradually change color. It changes its tonalities and becomes what we would term unpleasantly colored. We notice also that wherever positive emotion is expressed, creative emotion, you have pure color. Wherever negative emotions are expressed, you have impure color. Now, these emotional pressures do not immediately contaminate this field. For you can be angry of a Monday, and 3 years later you can be angry again, and there seems to be no particular effect. The anger expresses itself, the field becomes murky, then after a little while the anger subsides, the individual has a good dose of repentance, we find the colors changing, we find the reds and browns giving place to greens and blues, and the individual is out of his immediate pressure. If, however, there is a continuous pressure of some kind, of a negative nature, which we might term an habitual pressure, or a habit that is taking over the person, or that wonderful instinct to nag that has gotten out of hand, or a perpetual addiction to the gratification of selfishness. These continuous, repeated procedures begin to form structures within the structure itself of the Kamarupa. These structures will endure during the intensity of an explosion or an example of themselves, will then slowly decrease in intensity, but will not entirely vanish, and a little later will be revitalized with another powerful expression of the same intensity. And this will keep on and on and on until gradually these structures take on powerful psychic forms. They become either geometrical or in one way symbolical, or they may even take on mysterious forms such as are seen in archaic symbolism and allegory. These forms may take on the elementary appearance of monsters and things of that nature, and such forms are usually frightful, sometimes highly symbolical, like the appearance of a giant gradually manifesting within this body. These forms will impinge themselves in sleep upon the individual and will cause the positive psychological dreams that can be analyzed. Now, these forms can be and often are dissipated as they are fashioned. The moment they lose energy supply, the moment the vibration that created them no longer sustains them, they begin to fail. And in time, they can be again completely absorbed if the energy which sustained them is permanently deflected from them. They can also, under certain conditions, be changed by a rapid alternation or alteration of energy. The old mesmerists found this out, but more to the point, perhaps, is the idea that we have seen or heard about in the cures of disease achieved at sacred places, like the Shrine of Lourdes or the Shrine of Saint Anne de Beaupré in Canada. Here, a tremendous and absolute expression of faith, a complete, unconditioned expression of faith, has suddenly, apparently, produced a miraculous result. It means that a complete and tremendous catharsis of the Kamarupa has been accomplished by throwing into it a highly spiritualized vibration. It has broken these patterns. It has broken the forms which were being built by habit mechanisms of a negative nature. Paracelsus and many of the other earliest physicians were convinced that these forms arising within the Kamarupa are the real and constant cause of dangerous physical ailments. That because of them, and because of their direct impingement upon the physical body through the bloodstream, that they are the greatest and most malignant cause of toxin. And that if these vibrations are allowed to go uncorrected in the form of negative or evil emotion patterns, that they will ultimately result in the appearance of chronic diseases, often malignancies, in the flesh of the individual. And that grief and sorrow and hate do become the source of disease. Paracelsus was also of the opinion that these emotion entities are the cause of dangerous bacteria, and that bacteria and germs, so-called, are actually creations from the emotional excess of mankind, and that if human beings were not subject to evil thoughts and evil desires, that these creatures would not exist. That may or may not be true. We are not dogmatizing on it, but there is every reason to know that man does create by the intensities of his emotions and thoughts. The sphere of his creations we are not too well acquainted with, but that all intensity, that any vibration set in motion becomes an internal force in the universe, is difficult to categorically deny. In any event, regardless of whether the germs floating around have such an origin, we know that there are germs of death in man himself that are originating in the desire material of his nature. And that the cleansing and purification of this is very important to him. That it is part of the alchemical mystery of transmutation. For the desire body, or the Kamarupa, is the alchemical vessel in which the base metals of the seven senses must be transmuted into the gold of the universal medicine. So we have all these elements involved in the story of the Kamarupa. Also we know that according to the Indian mystic, in sleep, this is the sphere or plane to which the individual retires. He retires into the Kamarupa. Now, there are many stories and accounts as to what he does there. Some of them are highly symbolical, and this is one of the points where the various schools are not in agreement. But one thing they do acknowledge is that in this state, man is constantly conscious, even while asleep. And why he believes himself to be unconscious is because that the impressions are not brought through into the physical brain. Actually, the individual will say, psychologically speaking, dreams at all times when he is asleep. But his dreams are not remembered or not brought to his conscious awareness unless their intensities are abnormal, or the circumstances causing them are so archetypal that it becomes essential to him. The more common form of dream, of course, arises from some inconvenience of the body in which complete relaxation or the complete retirement of the entity into the Kamarupa is not possible. There we have him tossing about, still with the power of motion, which means that the desire body is still attached to the physical. We find him groaning and grunting, which is further indication of the same thing. And then we find a semi-dream state, in which perhaps he awakens with a nightmare or something of that nature, all of which proves that through one reason or another, the physical body has not been able to attain the relaxation which it required. Therefore, certain functions are still in operation. Now, remember that the Kamarupa is also the source of motion. Therefore, it must be and is the source of function within the body itself. It is very closely associated, therefore, with all derangements of functions, and therefore with what we commonly term functional ailments. The most immediate expressions of kamic unrest in the psychic life will therefore be various minor derangements of function. Today, for example, our humanity, particularly so-called Western civilized man, is more burdened with functional ailments than ever before in recorded history. His digestive difficulties, his insomnia, his minor heart ailments, all of these represent functional disorders due to psychic stress. Wherever, however, a functional derangement is not corrected, or the cause is not removed, or the symptoms merely blocked by medication, the pressure continues. And if the pressure continues long enough, there will be destruction of structure. And the moment there is this kind of activity, then we move into the organic field, and we have the individual set with some perhaps incurable ailment, resulting in general modification of structure and its attendant inability to function adequately. Thus, disease or dis-ease, as we know the word today, is essentially associated with kama, or desire. And as disaster means only an ill star, and it is definitely associated with the astral or starlight, or with the devas, the shiners, who were the stars. Now these stars are the psychic vortices within the Kamarupic body itself. And these are the ones whose immediate influence is most directly felt upon the psychic life at all times. We also then have to go on a little to the study of the effect of Devachan upon the consciousness of the person. We know, for instance, that in Buddhism, the individual must achieve final liberation by the attainment of the complete sublimation of personal existence. That there can be no desire without personal existence. Without desire, there can be no illusion. Without illusion, there can be no birth or rebirth, and no sequence of the nidanas. Without illusion, the individual cannot do wrong. Without illusion, man cannot break a universal law, or try to. Illusion, therefore, is the root of all things which have to do with pain, or with disaster, or with sorrow. We also know that even the most beautiful and sublimated of human emotions are still subject to a kind of pain, and that it is very difficult to divide frequently between love and pain, between even the most unselfish desire and the burdens which it carries with it and within it. Thus, there must be, in order to sustain man, certain illusions which are called constructive, or essentially good. And this relates essentially to one important factor, why man has a Kamarupic nature in the first place. Because Kamarupa, or the kamic body, is the source of motion. It is essentially the source of qualitative motion. And our most general term for constructive qualitative motion is progress. In other words, what is progress but a human being dreaming ahead of himself? Progress begins always with someone's hope, someone's vision, someone's desire. Progress is man attempting to attain the substance of things hoped for. Progress is the individual envisioning a future greater than now. Progress is also the individual seeking desperately to create a situation in which he can be secure. It is happiness. The individuals, many of them have told me that they live for tomorrow because today is no good. Of course, as long as they live that way, tomorrow will be no better, but they haven't found that out. But we all have certain hope in the future of things. And we are not inclined to take the prosaic attitude that future is nothing more or less than the extension of our own conduct into the unknown. We do not favor that thinking. So we do have auras of color which enable us to bear great burdens. The love of our children causes us to overlook their innumerable faults and makes it possible for us to make tremendous sacrifices for them. The love of our world may make us give our lives in the service of our fellow men, always because we have dreams and because we have hopes. And so patriots of one generation fight and die for a freedom that their descendants promptly give away. They will not live to see their dreams shattered any more than they will live to see their dreams come true. Thus there is a kind of dreaming that is a dreaming forward, an extension of something within us beyond ourselves, and then the desperate effort to bring the rest up to it and to make a new stand on a higher level of achievement. There are also dreams that approach very close to man's spiritual emergency. Man, in his emotion and visualization, envisions heaven, the nature of God, the love of God. He yearns for reunion with God, and his yearning is a desire. He longs to go home to the great and wonderful peace which, according to Buddha, rests at the end of the desert of waiting. These are his dreams, these are his hopes, these are his desires. And these in turn have moved him, have given us the saviors and the sages of mankind. Because every savior is someone who saw in man more than was obvious. If he had not seen it, he could not have gone on. Sometimes he imagined too much, and therefore taught too much, and the world never understood him. But he was still struggling on, believing in things, and believing is a kind of emotion. So our hopes, our faiths, our believings, our willingness to invest in the unknown for the common good, our most simple and personal contact with spirit as a feeling of goodness or a feeling of hope, all these things are part of desire. And because of these kind of desires, man is constantly moving toward the conquest of desire. For the ends of desire, these very ends he seeks, are only possible when evil desire ceases and only good desire remains. And as we try to analyze more and more about good desire, we see the strenuousness of this emotion gradually diminishing until the greatest desire of all is just the simple desire to be for reality itself. The simple longing for union with the eternal, which is the last desire of which man is capable and the highest. So in this whole sphere of man's psychic life, we have this motion through the great sphere of desire activity. And the desire activity of man is perhaps the greatest integrity that he has, if he can use it. It is far older than thought, and in many ways far wiser. And yet, because of his inability as yet to integrate its powers, man must pass through this period of disciplining. And this disciplining is, of course, represented in the great rituals of the old mysteries, where all these rituals, with their fantasies, their pageantries, their dramas, are stories of man's motion through the illusion of desire. Here he must fight evil monsters. Here he must be variously tempted and tried and tested. And only when he has passed through all these ordeals successfully, with his mind fixed firmly and totally upon truth, has he been able to achieve the mastery of the rites or rituals with which he has been associated. Incidentally also, this desire principle has to do with the concept of the world soul. Kama is, of course, not only desire in the profane sense, it is also love. Kama represents the emotional nature of universal being or deity itself. Therefore, man's experience is one on the level of emotion. Man learns mentally. Man acts physically, but man experiences only emotionally. And as experience is the most important thing in the world, it becomes essentially true that this desire sphere is one of the most important parts of man's nature. For by means of desire and the desire body, man is capable of achieving that experience which enables him to say, I know. Now, he may not be entirely correct when he says it, but he is still in the peculiar position of being able to accept on the grounds of a certain valid, undeniable testimony that has arisen within himself, which cannot be defended necessarily to others, nor can it be taken away from him by anyone else. For that which is experienced cannot be assailed by theory, doctrine, or dogma. It remains as a strangely internal validity. Thus, volition, as kamic motion, gradually is transformed into validity, which is kamic acceptance on a strange kind of complete inner proof. This proof cannot be achieved by the mind, but the mind in turn may be to a measure indoctrinated with it. And where this experience has occurred, the mind then becomes motivated by this experience of truth within the individual. Thus it is on the level of desire only that the human being is capable of the experience of identity. He can theorize on it. He can know that it is possible. He can experience it only on the level of desire, but he cannot attain it there. When I mean experience, therefore, I mean this. I mean that by intensity of emotional feeling or desire, man may, for example, have the apperception by experience of the fact of union with God. This desire does not achieve the union, nor is this experience a proof of the ultimate union. Plotinus, the Neoplatonist, tells us that in his contemplations and reveries, in his great spiritual exaltation or ecstasy, which is practically the summit of the emotional arc, that on 2 occasions he was lifted up into union with the blessed God. Now, this union lasted only a second, only an instant. But like the Havelock Ellis's account of the mystical experience in his Dance of Life, these moments transcended all possible knowledge, all possible learning, and established an experience fact within both Plotinus and Ellis that could never be shaken by any material pressure of any kind. Yet neither of these persons achieved what Buddha called the Mahaparinirvana. They did not enter into this union. They were not absorbed into it. They were not forever one with being. They apperceived it. They experienced it as Moses, standing upon the hill of Moab, looked out into the promised land but did not enter. He knew of the land by some strange power within his own nature. And the reason in the ancient Kabbalah that he was able to know the land was because God had given to him the Matrona as a bride. And the Matrona in the old Kabbalistic system was the power of the divine soul, or the presence of the mystery of God as the Shekinah, given inwardly to Moses. This, in the Eastern philosophy, parallels the idea that the purified Kamarupa becomes, so to say, the Beatrice who must lead Dante into the Paradiso, who must carry him onward into the greater worlds that lie beyond. She is the blessed damoiselle of Dante Gabriel Rossetti also, and the wonderful being sung by the troubadours. She represented the purified Kamarupa, or the power by which man may glimpse, through perfected and regenerated desire, the absolute love of God. So this vehicle becomes, through constant evolutionary process, gradually into a magnificent instrument who achieves for man the great end which must be attained. The Kamarupa is therefore, in its devachanic aspect, or in its Sukravati, it is the city of the gods. It is the temple. It is the mysterious assembly of the wise. It is the ecclesia, the sanctuary. For it is in here that all the skandhas, or powers of the personality, unite in worship for the Pentecostal experience. It is very interesting, therefore, that we should find it represented in the Apocalypse of St. John as the bride, the holy city, the bride of the Lamb, Jerusalem adorned as a bride. It represents, of course, the psychic soul nature, which finally becomes the instrument by which, through the tremendous experience of unselfish love, man approaches the mystery of universal reality. So the transmutation and evolution of this body through the ages produces the adept self, produces part of the mystery of the final hermetic marriage of the sun and moon. And the Kamarupa is actually, in this marriage, the moon. And the unfolded mental nature, ascended and united to the Buddhic sheath, becomes the sun. And the union of the sun and moon is the symbol of the God being. For it is through the union of the sun and moon that the great mystery of equilibrium is achieved, which is the nirvana, or the cessation of all action. Not negatively, but positively. The soul, then, is man's new body. And when man has finished with his evolution as a physical being, he will have another great cycle of evolution in the Kamarupic sheath. He will then find the development of his entire psychic nature on a level much higher than that which he knows today. He is building, consequently, a kind of embryo of a body that he will later use. And when the time comes for him to use this body, he will have it available. And he will be more or less like the city that is adorned as a bride, because this body is his own soul, or his own radiant vestment, that must be purified and redeemed, and must find its way ultimately to enlightenment. The story of this, incidentally, is magnificently set forth in the Bible in a book that very few people ever bother to read, the book of Ruth. And if you will study it carefully, you will see why it was that Ruth became a gleaner in the fields of Boaz. And why? Because she took no more than her part. Why ultimately the lands and the fields were given to her. And the story of the soul, which is a stranger from Moab, who becomes converted to the true faith, and then finds all these things happen, is simply the story of the soul. And Ruth represents, therefore, the soul's journey, which is the journey of the Kamarupa. And today psychology is concerned almost totally with this field. And this is one of the limitations which we think must ultimately be overcome. Namely, that as yet, psychology is a science because it is dealing with bodies, whether they be physical bodies or emotional bodies or mental bodies. But the great philosophies and the great religions of the world must deal with the being within the bodies. Not only the being within the physical body, but that which is behind the mind and behind the emotions. In other words, the entity itself and its relationship to eternity. Sukhalati, or Buddha's paradise to come, is therefore a place of rewards. It is not the ultimate, but it is the place where good rules, and good comes before perfection. And perfection is that ultimate state in which all of these bodies are resolved back into the principles that cause them. Every individual, incidentally, must realize that the Kamarupa, or his own emotional body, is not only channeled into his physical body through these connections which we have mentioned, particularly the bloodstream, but that in another direction, the Kamarupa itself, or the emotional sheath, is channeled into the great emotional energy field of the planet. Now the Hindus tell us, therefore, that the planet has a kind of purgatory, and that this purgatory is the result of the kamic pressure of all beings possessing kamic natures, and that all of their emotions, feelings, desires, passions, and intensities flow into the kamic substance of the planet. And that therefore, in this kamic substance, we have a constantly building toxin, very similar to the idea of the local smog. For just as the pollution of the material atmosphere may produce a dangerous situation, so the gradual pollution of the kamic sheath of the earth through the kamic intensities of creatures with desire may result in the creation of a strange field of psychic toxin. This psychic toxin, if it is unable to purify itself because of its amount or the mass of pollution which it must sustain, is therefore not available. This psychic material is not available in proper quality for the reforming of astral or psychic bodies. And entities who must build new bodies from this material must build it as though with a bad heredity. They must build it from a polluted source. Consequently, according to the ancient Hindu beliefs, certain methods, certain means were used to bring about the cleansing of the Kamarupa. We have, for example, told you of the idea of what a great faith could do at Lourdes in breaking the kamic pattern of an individual. And in the Hindu philosophy, the Kamarupa of the earth is purified by a tremendous psychic experience in the emotional field of the planet. And this is accomplished by an avatara, or the appearance of a deity. Therefore, Krishna says, when virtue fails upon the earth, then I come forth. And virtue being, of course, an emotional quality, a positive, constructive emotion. Whenever the Vedas or the laws are lost in the darkness, Vishnu takes form and rescues them and destroys the monster that is attempting to devour them. And of course this monster is believed or symbolically intended to represent the mystery of the astral light, or the mystery of the devouring negative emotion field, which is being constantly built up by human perversion. A great example of the perversion is war, in which millions of human beings are brought into this terrible catastrophe and are lured beyond their emotional capacities by the selfishness which, of course, incidentally, has to be in themselves. But nevertheless, they do not know this and are therefore subjected to these pressures, which they should be able to handle, but they cannot. Therefore, whenever this emergency is said to arise, the Hindus believe that an avatar appeared. Now, we have already mentioned the idea that the channel of this kamic material is always called blood. Therefore, we have the story of Golgotha and the cleansing blood, and the power of Christ to break the kamic envelope of the earth. These legends we find in the Rosicrucian mystical writings of the medieval and early periods, and incidentally among the Gnostics, and reference will be found to it in some of the writings of Philo-Judaeus, one of the earliest mystics to interpret some of these ancient passages. But always this idea of the appearance of the Avatar, or the appearance of the Messiah, and the power of the cleansing blood, the means of breaking the patterns by which individuals gradually lock themselves. The same thing happens with the individual who sincerely gains the spiritual consolation of a great belief. He then finds that the cleansing of the Kamarupa begins in himself. Faith and fear cannot live together. Light and darkness cannot dwell in the same house. And where the light in man, the light of faith, of beauty, of love, of hope, and of truth, gains intensity, we find the shadows in the Kamarupa gradually fading out. The psychologist knows this is true. Carl Jung has said that without religion, persons past middle life will seldom be cured of their psychological difficulties. The reason that religion is able to accomplish certain of these things, or sublimity of any kind, or spiritual conviction or great aspiration within the individual, is that they set up new vibratory vortices that are completely contrary to the negative patterns which have produced the difficulty. And under the pressure of these new, tremendously intensified vibrations, the old forms are shattered, and we see the ancient picture like we see on the wall of the Sistine Chapel in Rome, where in the great symbol of the Last Judgment we see the heroic figure of Christ standing in the midst, and around and below him the falling demons going in all directions. Here is the statement, of course, which would be almost identical to that of the Hindus, namely the concept of enlightened love breaking up the emotion demons in the Kamarupa. So all of these things work together. They are all stories and symbols. St. George slaying the dragon, all of the dragon slayers represent essentially man breaking the kamic pattern. And until he is able to break this pattern of his negative desires, he cannot use the great substance of Kama for the purpose for which it was intended. For out of this same substance that is now poisoning him is to be fashioned in the mysterious vessel of his own soul, the symbol of the sacred Eucharist. But actually, the Kamarupa is not only symbolically the cup of poison that was given to Socrates, but it is the Holy Grail and the symbol of the ever-flowing blood, the sangre real, the blood of the King. These mysteries of the cleansing blood always, therefore, tie into the Kamarupa. Systems of healing built upon the analysis of the blood and the study of the blood structure also will ultimately point the way to the mysterious energy that is conveyed in it. So man loves and hates, hopes and fears, builds and destroys because he has blood. When he does it enthusiastically enough, we call him red-blooded. But what actually it tells us is that these things are the pressures of his own soul, the pressures of his own psyche, and that until he is able to bring this soul into union with his purpose, until he is able to put the golden collar on the unicorn, he will never understand the power of the soul as an instrument of release, nor will he realize the tremendous benediction of beauty and of all the great arts and great music and great books and all these things that have come from the soul longings of mankind. And so this soul, dark in its one face and light in the other, this twofold mystery, one of selfishness and the other of sublimity, this is man's challenge. And it is here that the great work of human evolution has to be carried on. For it is the peculiar and mysterious duty of man at this stage in his karmic evolution to redeem his own soul. And he does so by regenerating the great field of desire and transforming it into the living sanctuary or place of holiness unto the Lord. Well, I think that's the subject for this evening.